Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
All right, let's dive into something really interesting today, something you might not expect. We're talking about Ukraine, but not the war, not directly anyway. We're going deep on Ukraine's mineral wealth.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a side of Ukraine we don't hear enough about.
You know, we see the headlines about the conflict, the humanitarian crisis, all that. But under the surface, literally, Ukraine is sitting on a treasure trove of valuable resources. We're talking billions, maybe even trillions of dollars worth of minerals. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is, and it's something that often gets missed in the broader conversation about Ukraine. People tend to focus on the conflict, and understandably so. But, this mineral wealth is a huge part of the story, too.
Huge is an understatement. I was reading that Ukraine has something like 5% of the world's critical raw materials. 5%. That's a staggering number, and it puts Ukraine on the map as a major player in the global resource game.
Exactly. It's not just a small deposit here or there. Ukraine is a significant holder of some of the most sought-after minerals on the planet. And that's what makes this whole situation so interesting, right?
Yeah.
You've got this country at the heart of a geopolitical tug of war, and at the same time, it's sitting on this incredible wealth of resources that everyone is suddenly very interested in.
Okay, so let's break it down. What kind of minerals are we talking about here? What's got everyone so interested in Ukraine's underground treasure chest?
Let's start with graphite. Ukraine has massive deposits of graphite, which, as you know, is a key ingredient in those lithium-ion batteries that are powering everything these days, from smartphones to electric cars.
Right, those batteries are everywhere. And with the whole world shifting towards electric vehicles, that demand for graphite is only going to go up, right?
Oh, absolutely. And Ukraine is poised to be a major supplier. But graphite is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Ukraine also has significant lithium reserves. And we're talking about a third of Europe's total lithium, which is pretty remarkable.
Wow, so not only could they be supplying the batteries for those electric cars, but they also have the lithium to make the batteries themselves. That's a pretty powerful position to be in.
Definitely. And it's a strategic asset for Europe, especially as they're trying to transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. Access to a reliable local source of lithium is going to be essential for that.
Okay, so we've got graphite, lithium, what else? I mean, this treasure chest has got to have more than just 2 gems in it, right?
Oh, there's plenty more. Don't forget about titanium. Ukraine used to be a major global producer of titanium. It's a super strong and lightweight metal that's used in aerospace, defense, medical implants, even jewelry. The list goes on and on.
Titanium, that's right. I remember reading something about that. And then, of course, there are the rare earth metals. I know those are essential for all kinds of high-tech applications. What's the story with those in Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine has deposits of those as well. We're talking about things like neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, these elements you probably haven't heard of, but that are absolutely crucial for making things like smartphones, wind turbines, even military equipment.
Okay, you're blowing my mind here. I honestly had no idea Ukraine had such a diverse and valuable collection of minerals. It's like they're sitting on a gold mine, or should I say a mineral mine.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And it brings us to the reason we're having this deep dive today. You've probably heard about the recent U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal, right? It's making headlines.
Yeah, I've seen some headlines, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details. What does this deal actually entail?
Well, basically, the U.S. is gaining access to Ukraine's mineral wealth in exchange for continued military and financial aid. Kind of a trade, you could say.
Okay, resources for support on the surface. It sounds straightforward enough, but knowing how these things usually go, I'm guessing there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
You're absolutely right to be skeptical. There's a lot to unpack here, especially when you consider the context of the war and the global competition for these resources. It's not a simple transaction by any means.
All right, I'm intrigued. Let's unpack it then. What are some of the details that make this deal so, well, complex and potentially controversial?
Well, think about this. The initial U.S. demand was for potentially $500 billion in revenue from these minerals.
$500 billion. Whoa, that's an astronomical number. Clearly, they see these minerals as being incredibly valuable.
Right, exactly. And even though that figure was later dropped, it shows you just how much emphasis the U.S. is placing on these resources. They clearly see Ukraine's mineral wealth as a major strategic asset.
Makes you wonder what the long game is here, right? I mean, is this just about helping Ukraine, or is there a bigger play at hand?
Right. And then you have former President Trump, who was, involved in the early stages of this deal. He talked about getting American taxpayer money back plus from the deal. So there's definitely a sense that the U.S. is looking for a return on its investment here.
Interesting. So maybe it's not just about altruism after all. It sounds like there are different perspectives on the motivation behind this whole thing.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where things start to get a little messy. You've got President Zelensky of Ukraine saying he can't sell his state, meaning he sees it as a partnership, not just a transaction. And then there's all this back and forth about how much aid the U.S. has actually given. Zelensky says it's less than what Trump claims. So you've got conflicting narratives, potential power imbalances, and a lot of questions about transparency and accountability. It's definitely not black and white.
No, it sounds like a very gray area for
Yeah.
sure. And when you throw in the ongoing war and Russia's involvement, well, it's even more complicated. Speaking of Russia, I know they've got their own interests in Ukraine's mineral wealth. What's their play in all of this?
Yes, Russia. Well, this is where things get really interesting. President Putin actually offered the U.S. access to rare earth minerals.
Wait, what? Really?
Yeah, and he even suggested he could supply some of these minerals from the regions of Ukraine that Russia currently occupies.
Hold on a second. He's trying to undercut the U.S.-Ukraine deal by offering the same resources, but with the added bonus of, basically legitimizing their control over those disputed territories.
It certainly looks that way, and that throws a whole other wrench into an already complex dynamic. You've got the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia all vying for control of these valuable resources. It's a power play with potentially huge consequences.
Yeah, it sounds like this whole situation is about a lot more than just minerals. It's about geopolitics, international relations, maybe even the future of global power. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface. It really is. And I think it raises a lot of important questions about the role of resources in international relations, especially in a conflict zone like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of makes you think about the long game here, right? Like, what are the potential ripple effects of this deal? But before we get too deep into that, I want to circle back to the actual minerals themselves for a minute. We talked about graphite and lithium, but I'm curious to get a better sense of the scale here.
Oh, sure, yeah. So when we talk about Ukraine's graphite reserves, we're talking about 19 million tons.
19 million tons. That's just, I can't even wrap my head around a number that big. And that's enough to make a lot of batteries, right?
A lot of batteries, yeah.
Yeah.
Enough to make a real difference in the global electric vehicle market. And then with the lithium, well, Ukraine has roughly a third of Europe's lithium reserve.
The third of Europe's lithium. That's incredible. So they're not only poised to be a major player in the electric vehicle revolution, but they could also be a key supplier for Europe's clean energy future. I mean, that's a game changer.
Oh, it is. And then there's the titanium, which we touched on earlier. Before the war, Ukraine was producing something like 7% of the global titanium supply.
Wow, 7%. That's a significant chunk. I knew titanium was used in aerospace and defense, but what else is it used for?
All sorts of things, actually. Medical implants, bicycles, golf clubs, even things like paint and sunscreen. Like a very versatile metal.
So we're not just talking about obscure metals used in high-tech gadgets. These are materials that are connected to everyday products that we all use.
Right, exactly. And I think that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating and so complex, right? We're talking about resources that are essential for our modern world, but they're caught in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war.
It's almost like a high-stakes chess match with Ukraine's mineral wealth as the prize. And speaking of stakes, it's hard not to think about the ethical implications of all this. I mean, is it right to be making deals and vying for control of these resources while a war is raging and people are suffering? It feels, I don't know, a little bit uncomfortable, to be honest.
It's a really important question to consider, and there are no easy answers. On the one hand, you could argue that helping Ukraine develop its mineral sector could actually be a good thing. It could provide much-needed economic support and help the country rebuild after the war is over.
Yeah, I see that side of it. But then there's the risk of exploitation, right? I mean, especially when you consider the power dynamics at play. You've got these powerful nations driven by their own interests, and then you've got Ukraine, a country in a very vulnerable position.
You're right, there's a real danger there. The last thing anyone wants to see is Ukraine's resources being exploited for the benefit of others, without fair compensation or regard for the long-term well-being of the Ukrainian people.
Absolutely. It feels like we need to be incredibly careful about how we approach this whole issue of resource extraction, especially in a conflict zone. We can't let the pursuit of profit or political advantage overshadow the human cost of this war.
I couldn't agree more. We need to be thinking about the long-term consequences here, not just the immediate gains. And we need to ensure that any resource extraction benefits the people of Ukraine, not just corporations or foreign governments.
And that raises another question for me. What role can international organizations play in all this? Is there a way to ensure that resource extraction in Ukraine is done responsibly and sustainably?
That's a great question. I mean, in theory, international organizations could play a key role in setting standards, monitoring activities, and holding everyone accountable.
Yeah, it seems like we need some kind of oversight or regulation to prevent exploitation.
Right, but the challenge is that these organizations often lack the authority to actually enforce those rules, especially when you're dealing with powerful nations who might not be so keen on following them. And then there's the whole issue of national sovereignty. Many countries are very hesitant to cede control over their natural resources, even if they're in a difficult position. It's a tough situation, for sure.
It's definitely a complex web of competing interests, ethical considerations, and, power dynamics. It's like one of those multidimensional chessboards they have in Star Trek. Every move has consequences, and it's hard to predict how things will ultimately play out.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of consequences, there's another important aspect we need to consider, and that's the environmental impact. I mean, increased mining activity, especially if it's not done sustainably, can have devastating consequences for ecosystems and local communities.
Oh, absolutely. That's something we can't afford to overlook. We've seen what can happen when mining operations prioritize profit over environmental protection. It can be a real disaster.
Yeah, you're right. Deforestation, water pollution, displacement of communities, these are all real risks.
Yep.
So it's not just about who controls the resources, it's also about how those resources are extracted and the potential environmental cost.
It's another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation, but I appreciate you bringing up the environmental piece. It's something that often gets lost in the shuffle, especially when there are so many other factors at play.
It's definitely crucial. At the end of the day, any solution to this crisis needs to prioritize the well-being of both the Ukrainian people and the environment they depend on. It has to be sustainable on all levels.
Okay, that's a great point. And I think it's a good place to pause and acknowledge our listener who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this information. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the specific minerals found in Ukraine to the geopolitical dynamics at play. It's a lot to digest.
It is, but I think it's important to remember that complexity doesn't mean we should shy away from these issues.
Right, exactly. In fact, the more we understand the complexities, the better equipped we are to ask the right questions, demand accountability from our leaders, and advocate for solutions that are just, equitable, and sustainable.
Couldn't said it better myself. And speaking of solutions, I think it's time we bring Russia back into the conversation. Remember Putin's offer to the U.S. regarding those rare earth minerals? That adds a whole other layer of intrigue to an already fascinating situation.
Okay, so let's get back to this whole Russia angle. Putin's offer to the U.S. for rare earth minerals, that's a pretty bold move, isn't it?
Well, it's definitely strategic. On one level, it allows Russia to position itself as a key player in the global rare earth market, right? These minerals are essential for all sorts of technologies, and by offering to supply them, Russia can exert a lot of influence.
So it's a power play.
Yeah.
Using their resource wealth as leverage.
Exactly, and not just on a global scale. It also gives them a way to potentially drive a wedge between the U.S. and Ukraine, offering a tempting alternative, testing the strength of that partnership.
Divide and conquer, classic strategy. But it puts the U.S. in a tough spot, right? On one hand, they want to support Ukraine, counter Russian aggression, but on the other hand, they've got this offer of valuable resources dangling in front of them. It's a real dilemma.
It is a dilemma, and I think it highlights the complexities of this whole situation. Because if the U.S. were to accept Russia's offer, well, it would basically mean legitimizing their control over those occupied territories, right? Rewarding their actions. And it would send a pretty mixed message to Ukraine and other allies.
Yeah, like the U.S. is willing to prioritize its own needs over its commitments to its partners. Not a good look. So even if you set aside the ethical implications, accepting that offer would have some pretty serious geopolitical consequences.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes this whole story so fascinating. Because it's not just about minerals, it's about power, influence, the future of global order. It's all intertwined.
Yeah, it feels like we're witnessing a realignment of global power in real time, with these resources as a key battleground.
I think that's a really good way to put it. And it makes you wonder, are we headed for a new era of resource wars? As the demand for these minerals keeps rising, the competition is only going to intensify.
So Ukraine might be a preview of what's to come. A taste of the kind of conflicts we might see in the future.
It's certainly a possibility, and one we need to be thinking about very seriously. Because if we're not careful, we could easily fall into a pattern of competition, conflict, instability. We need to find a different way.
Okay, so what's the alternative? How do we prevent that future? How do we manage these resources responsibly and equitably?
Well, I think international cooperation is key. Stronger agreements on things like fair trade practices, environmental regulations, mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully. We need to be working together, not against each other.
So more collaboration, less competition. Makes sense. But what about the demand side of things? I mean, as long as the demand for these minerals keeps going up, isn't there always going to be pressure to, secure those resources, even if it means cutting corners or bending the rules?
That's a great point. We need to be thinking about the demand side, too. Investing in research and development to find alternative materials, reducing our reliance on these critical minerals, making our supply chains more resilient.
So it's a multifaceted challenge that requires a pretty holistic approach. It's not just about controlling the resources, it's about creating a system that works for everyone, a system that's fair, sustainable, and doesn't come at the expense of the environment or vulnerable communities.
Exactly. And that's where informed citizens like our listener come in. Because by understanding these issues, by asking the right questions, by demanding accountability from our leaders, well, we can help create that better future.
That's a great message to end on. I know we've covered a lot of ground today. It's a complex issue, but I hope our listener is walking away with a better understanding of what's at stake here, not just in Ukraine, but globally.
I hope so too. Because these choices we're making today, they have far-reaching consequences. And we all have a role to play in shaping a future where resources are used to build a more just and sustainable world, not to fuel conflict and division.
Absolutely. Well said. And that's it for our deep dive today. As always, we encourage you to continue exploring this issue, read more about it, do your own research, stay engaged, because these are conversations that need to be happening. And the more informed we all are, the better chance we have of creating that better future we're all hoping for. Thanks for listening.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.